Within the first hour, one of the young men in the group, he got up out of his chair, grabbed hold of the felt marker and started to draw on the flip chart about ego states and communication. This young lad was really empowered and he was all of a sudden really articulate. He was clever. He was insightful.
Yeah. He
could own his intelligence and have it respected through this language. So
fantastic.
I'm getting goosebumps listening to that. This is Three People in Your Head, a podcast about getting the best out of yourself and others. Co-hosted by Matt Taylor and myself, John Fleming.
In this episode, we speak with Giles Barrow. Giles is an educator and a writer, and he's also a teaching and supervising transactional analyst in the educational field. Giles shares his experience and stories of using educational TA in all kinds of different environments, from schools to adult education. Giles, thank you so much for joining us for our podcast, Three People in Your Head. Why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do, kind of your roles currently and your responsibilities, that kind of thing.
My name's Giles Barrow, and I live in East Anglia in Suffolk, a very rural area, born and bred in South London, and professionally started out as a teacher, pretty much around South London, both in mainstream and then in more specialist settings. And was, I suppose, responsible for establishing support services for schools, particularly for around the theme of children's provision for excluded students.
Right, and that's the specialist element, is it?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And currently, what's your roles that you're involved in at the moment?
Well, I spread my time across a number of areas of work. I'm a teaching and supervising transactional analyst, which means part of my time is spent supporting colleagues who are looking to train as transactional analysts, or supervising them, helping them prepare for their professional qualification and so on. But I'm also involved in teaching transactional analysis more generally. And then I maintain my link with schools and young people by working directly in schools, often with head teachers or people with more specialist roles around the theme of leadership or school culture or complex cases, I suppose you could say, in both primary aged and secondary.
And aren't you involved in farming in some way or form?
Yeah, so as a result of moving out of London, although it wasn't particularly planned, I developed a real interest and then commitment to running a small holding. So for the last 10 years or so, we've been running a small holding, raising livestock, growing our own fruit and veg, and so engaged in a new. Well, it doesn't feel so new now, but what was definitely a real new opening phase of life, really.
Yeah. So it's wide and varied, your work.
Yes, I suppose looking in from the outside, it looks wide and varied, but from the inside, it feels very integrated and whole. So the kind of underlying theme is cultivation, really, one way or the other. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Giles, I'm really interested to know, if you were a teacher, what was it that got you interested in psychology or more importantly, transactional analysis? What was it about being a teacher that drew you to study it or become interested in it?
Well, there's a bit of a story to this, and it'll refer to Trudy Newton, who I know you're also talking with. So to get into a little bit of the detail, So I was in mainstream teaching, and I was very drawn to those children who were really struggling to fit in, many of whom were being chucked out of school because around behaviour. And I moved into specialist provision. And at the time, and I'm talking about sort of the 90s, the dominant frame of reference for working with these children was something called behaviour management, the idea being that children learn how to behave and someone should be able to teach them how to behave. And so there was a lot of what was called behavioural approaches, all about getting into very specific target setting of kids, rewarding kids for doing what you wanted them to do, and so on and so forth. And when I took on running the services for students out of school, I'm not too sure exactly why, but I knew there was something lacking in this behavioural approach. I had an appetite for something richer than that, and I sent my staff, my individual members of staff, all over the country. I said, go and find me something different.
Wow.
I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew that there needed to be something. And so members of my team came back with all sorts of weird and wonderful things. And we did have quite it was quite a peculiar, in some respect, jumble sale of a 6-month period in which we were trying all sorts of things. And
what was the weirdest?
What was it? I can't remember what it was called now. It was some sort of approach. I just remember in the middle of the training with this guy, he blew up a paper bag and burst it, and I can't remember quite why. I don't know, we just got ourselves into some really strange nooks and crannies of approaches to working with this group of students. And it was, I forget what it was called now, but anyway, back on track. There was a young woman in my team who said she knew of someone who did this thing called transactional analysis in her village, incidentally out in Suffolk. So I said, bring me this woman, and let's see what she can do. So I was very Anyway, so and what I did is I set a bit of a task. I said, tell her to come here, and I'm going to ask if she can train not just our staff, but our staff with our young people at the same time.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's a bit of an ask, really.
Tall order. Yeah,
it was. And so the trainer was Trudy, and she arrived. I understand that she was quite nervous about the prospect.
Yeah.
And also was quite, she was getting quite frustrated, or really had a strong appetite and ambition to be able to bring transactional analysis to the world of schools, because for her, she had been very much involved in adult education through social work training. So this was a bit of a break for her. This was, an opportunity that I know only now I know that she was keen to engage in. I didn't know that at the time. And I'd set up quite a testy environment. So she came into this unit where I had maybe a dozen of our staff, and then there was a dozen of our young people, maybe 15, 16-year-olds, very bruised and battered from mainstream school.
Yeah.
And she began teaching us, or starting to open up transactional analysis for us. And after must have been within the first hour, one of the young men in the group, I remember, I see him now, he got up out of his chair, grabbed hold of the felt marker, and started to draw on the flip chart. This was about ego states and communication. So he'd been exposed to it for, 40 minutes, and there he was up on the board explaining what was happening to him in mainstream school when he was getting into trouble with some of the senior staff.
Brilliant. And
that really made quite an impact on me. Pretty much, well, when I say sold it to me, that sounds a bit kind of commercial, but the impact was such that in that episode, I realised that here was a model which was highly accessible to a wide range of people, and was equally very powerful. Yeah. I mean, this young lad was really empowered, and he was all of a sudden really articulate. He was clever. He was insightful. Yeah. He could own his intelligence and have it respected through this language. So so I'm telling a story there in response, Matt, to your question.
It's fantastic.
I'm getting goosebumps listening to that. That's really touching. That he had begun to understand what was going on for him. That's so empowering, and I can see now why transactional analysis has value in education. So you're coming from the point of view, Giles, that there's students who need this support for many different reasons, and come from different walks of life. Okay.
Yeah.
Your experience, Giles. How old does a child have to be in order to kind of grasp the basics of it?
Well, yeah, it's a question I often get asked. I've personally worked with children as young as 8 years old with the idea of strokes, for example.
Yeah.
Judy Hay's window on the world, that children in primary, upper primary certainly, are able to grasp that. In some parts of the UK, we've got a middle school system, and so there we're looking at sort of 12-year-olds who are more than able to understand ego states and the drama triangle.
Yeah.
Where we've got very young children, I've tended to introduce transactional analysis to staff to create a more emotionally literate or more relationally rich space. Yeah. Rather than to teach it explicitly to little ones.
And what are the benefits that you see in the class with children that are able to pick those principles up?
Well, I think in a sense, it's not much different than what I noticed with adults, in that it provides a language for understanding what's going on internally and what's going on externally. Yeah. And I think children get it. I remember I was in a secondary school in East London, and this school was setting up an internal sort of support centre, and they were wanting to use transactional analysis as the framework for use with children. And it was just in the I think it was the first meeting or the first visit, and I was meant to be having a discussion with a couple of staff in their room. Yeah. And we were just sort of revising the ego state model. Yeah. And I had it on a sheet on the floor, and all of a sudden this lad bursts in. He's kind of, red with rage. He's really kind of, very kind of vigilant, and has just been chucked out of science. Yeah. And he's raging around the room, and the two mentors, the two members of staff are doing some good work with him. And he sees this sheet on the floor. It's like a bed sheet, so it's quite a large sheet. And I asked if he was interested in it, and he was. And it was very straightforward for him to start to track what had just gone on in the science lesson. Yeah, with what was on the floor. So it was. I think it's quite powerful. Yeah, to provide people with a language. Yeah, that opens up possibilities. Really. Fantastic. And I think that's the same for grown-ups and children.
Yeah, definitely. And so within the framework of transactional analysis, what is your favourite piece of theory, and why?
I think the cycle of development. Yeah, I think the cycle of development is such an enduring model. I would say in helping me frame and negotiate work in education, contracting principles are just so fundamental. But the cycle of development is a multi-level model which helps me in all sorts of directions, whether or not it's supervising a complex case, or thinking about a member of staff's position within the staff team or their career, or it's very, very versatile, really.
And can you just explain a little bit about what you mean by development, what that means within the framework of transactional analysis?
So for me, there's an understanding, a recognition that in the course of one's life or one's career, we go through different stages. Yeah. That are incremental. They're about how we grow a little bit more. Yeah. And those phases have a distinct character. They have a distinct experience. Yeah. And that the cycle of development is just one way of making sense of that developmental process.
Right. Okay. And I know from having actually done a workshop with you when I did my foundation year in TA that the cycle of development is different because it's a cycle, that normally these development models are linear. And so can you explain a little bit more about that theory?
Yeah. So a lot of ideas, certainly in the West, are rooted in some of the early history of psychology, which tended to be founded in a particular way of viewing the world, which was quite European, and some would argue quite male in orientation. A lot of the early developmental theorists were men, and they came from a very particular part of the globe. So they tended to make sense of development as if people grow up along a line, that they grow up, if you like, only chronologically.
Yeah.
And so once you found out how old somebody is, you can then start to assess whether or not developmentally they are functional.
Right.
And the key is finding out, how old they are. And I find those linear models, they kind of make sense in my head, but they don't correspond with lived experience.
Okay.
And for that, I choose to use something which is more of an indigenous idea of how we live, or you might argue a more natural way of how we live, which is that we go through cycles, and that these, if you like, repeat over the course of a lifetime.
Right.
So growing up isn't something that's completed by the time we're 16 or 6 or some sort of arbitrary chronological marker.
And can you give an example of where we might be going round a cycle again and repeat in this development?
Well, I think someone going into a new post, a new job, might be such. When a new baby comes along in the family, when maybe for those listeners who have got children, when the children go from primary to secondary school, but also maybe some even more significant times, like when there's been a key bereavement, maybe a separation or retirement. That's what I notice, and I hear this in how their stories are told, is a sense of going back to some kind of beginning stage again, where we don't know whether or not we can even exist in this new space.
Yeah.
So those are some examples I find.
And would you have any advice that you would give to parents or adults who might be responsible or looking after a child in specialist provision in any way? What kind of...
in specialist provision?
Yeah.
So one of the things I notice with students, which is fairly typical if they're involved in special education in some way, is that they experience more transitions than children that don't.
Right.
And they, particularly those children with social, emotional, mental health issues, they may find themselves in and out of different provisions, and some of them may well be in and out of different care provision as well.
Right. So there's less stability.
And I find that the cycle of development stages are very useful for thinking about in terms of preparing for children for transition, for supporting them in transition, and then into some reintegrating into some new place. So, in terms of advice, that's a bit of a big question.
Well, how about I rephrase it, Giles? What about if I was to say, is there a particular way in which you would prepare? Like, what steps would you take if you were preparing for a particular transition? Is there certain conversations that need to be had, or things that need to be said, or how do you use the cycle of development?
Right. Okay. So
these young people.
So my experience in transition is that saying goodbye to the current place is a really important part of beginning to say hello to the next one. And I notice for a lot of children involved in special provision, they haven't had a very good goodbye. And so the unfinished business of that school placement gets in the way of them being able to start anew in the second placement. So strangely, I would say an awful lot of good preparation for making a move is, strangely enough, saying goodbye, which involves taking stock, celebrating what's been achieved, beginning to attach to a new place, possibly, knowing that moving on is normal, and that people can feel sad even though you're not going to be there.
Right.
And it's okay for the child to feel some sad or loss.
Right.
So yes, I would concentrate on what sometimes referred to as the moving on stage before beginning to start to look at connecting with the new place. That sounds kind of pretty obvious stuff, but I find it rare for that to have been successfully achieved.
That's fantastic advice. When we moved house, when my son was just a few years old, and my mum, who'd actually done a little bit of training in transactional analysis, she said, you need to allow him, and I think he was a toddler, maybe 3, you need to allow him to understand the story of saying goodbye to where he's been before we move on. And and it really rings true. And the move for him was so much better and less upsetting because of that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking as well, I was talking to my sister recently, and she was telling me that my niece and nephew now go and spend their last day of school each year before the summer holidays in the classroom and with the teacher that they're going to have next year. And I was really impacted by that, because that's definitely not something that we ever did when we were in school. We left and then we went back into a new room, and we'd never met the person before, and it was all quite daunting. And I can really hear now in what you're saying, Giles, that how we might have overlooked it, it's actually really important, in creating a space in which these people feel like they can learn. And I'm wondering what it sits below all of this, Giles, am I picking you up right, is that you have to create an environment in which learning can be done easily, and that sometimes that gets overlooked in mainstream schooling. Is that that's slightly what you're touching off?
Well, I know you said making learning easily or something there, John.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. This might take us off into a different direction. It's I want to play around with whether or not it's that helpful when learning is easy.
Okay.
Let's take it in that direction then.
Yeah, it doesn't stay with cycle of development necessarily. But I think it does lead into something about educational transactional analysis. I actually think that part of my objective as an educator is to be quite disruptive. And with that disruptiveness, there comes some dis-ease.
Okay. And why is that?
So why
disruptive? What is it about disruption that works?
Because there is a view that the teacher, the role of the teacher, is to interrupt the life of the student and to bring to the student or open for the student the opportunity of some new experience of the world.
Yeah.
And that it isn't actually intended to be a comfortable experience, because the world, if you like, is different from how I would like it to be.
Right.
That's quite an infantile sense of the world, which is that it should fit with how I want it to be.
Right.
And so the purpose of the teacher is to represent, if you like, how the world doesn't always fit with what I want it to be or how I understood it.
Yeah.
And I think that can be quite uneasy. That's why I'm just picking up on John's reference earlier to the job of the educators to make it learning easy. I may be just picking on that word.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point, though. And I guess that's just something that's kind of bred into, well, I can't speak for everybody, but definitely I know that about wanting to make things easy for people.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. It doesn't necessarily it's easy. I suppose what I was getting at, and I might have used the wrong word, was that there's something about accounting for the environment within classrooms or where education's taking place. Right. That seems important, and it seems like what you're talking to is that TA has something to offer in helping set the right environment so that these transitions or the cycles that people are going on the development phases are getting tended to in the way that they should be. And maybe I was going a stretched extra in that, and then I was forming the assumption that if that is done, then the job of teaching and learning, whether it be English, math, science, is somewhat more successful. Maybe successful is a better word than easy.
Okay, so I think, John, where I think there may well be a cross purposes here is that I think schooling is different from education.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's interesting insight.
So I think schooling has got a lot to do with upbringing.
Okay.
It's a public project, if you like, in which we culturally hope that schooling contributes to the upbringing of our next generation.
Right. So it's about raising the children.
I think there's an awful lot to do with raising children that, is part of the role of being a school teacher.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing is that, and I accept that part of upbringing, involves being kind of safe and affirmed, of being supported in our maturation as we go through these stages, that there's a kind of a process of upbringing, and schools are, play a really significant part on behalf of our communities to do that. And I don't want to equate that with all that education can be.
That's really interesting, because I know I have heard teachers say things like, but it's not our job to raise the kids. It's our job to get them to do well in their exams or to pass their exams, which is very different from what you're describing. You could argue that the teacher believes that part of upbringing is to socialise the child and prepare them for the kind of qualifications that they're going to need in order to, as a passport, if you like, within the broader society. So you could argue that remains a legitimate position, and is part of the upbringing. I just don't want. I'm quite resistant about the idea that education equates to what goes on in schools. Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that is a different and challenging point of view. I mean, it's one that I tend to agree with, and I'm wondering, just for the people listening, Giles, what is it about that? Because I can hear in how you're saying you're quite passionate about this.
Yeah.
Where does that come from? Where there's obviously somewhere that comes from within you, or an experience, or a time in your work where you began to notice this. Where does that come from?
Yeah, that's a good
question.
Yeah, it's a different level of question. Okay, so where that takes me is that I think that something which can happen in schools, but it's, if you like, outside of the control of school, is that students, and I think of this myself, but I know it pertains to a lot of us, have had what I call an encounter with a teacher.
Yeah.
And in which something happens. In other words, there's a disruption in who I think I can be in the world. And that has got a lot to do with what I call the personhood of the teacher.
Yeah.
It's like someone turns up in my life and there's something irreplaceable about that. And this is kind of outside of all of that talk earlier about upbringing.
Yeah.
It's quite unpredictable in some respect. It's far more volatile. It's unplanned. And I think that's where education takes place. It's a very particular idea about education.
Yeah.
And that teacher may well be my science teacher. That's not really the point. It's the fact that it's them that have shown up.
As a person, as opposed to just a role.
Yes. So I think an awful lot of emphasis in contemporary schooling has been to make systems and processes really watertight, so that anybody can do them. So the kind of who's doing it isn't as important as the fact that someone's doing it.
Yeah.
Anyone's.
And then bringing that back into the framework of TA, why is TA important in this? What part does transactional analysis play in what you're describing?
I think one of the things is that in relation to scripts, this idea of that we have a story that we create and tell ourselves and then live out. Yeah. I think many people have a script around education and of themselves as a learner.
Yeah.
Based on their school experience. So they can have a sense that they're stupid.
Right.
A belief that they're stupid, or they make a decision that they're clumsy.
Yeah.
On the basis of their experience within school.
Yeah.
And that can, I think, really limit their view of who they might be. And I think that challenging individuals' script around education is sometimes very important, because how many people I know who have been really immobilized by the idea of an interview or some sort of test, or going into further professional development, or all sorts of performance where they have grave doubts and are, as I say, immobilized. And so often the story of that lack of confidence stems from a classroom.
Yeah. And so often I come across these pivotal moments when people were infants in primary school, where a person in authority said something to them, and that's taken as verbatim and life-changing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think sometimes it's overlooked that, if in classical TA theory, script begins to form about 3 years old through to about 6 years old, if we want to use that kind of classical model, well, certainly in this country, most kids are in some kind of institution by that time. In other words, schools are not the arena where the script is played out. It's the arena where it's being created.
Right.
Yes.
This might be a bit of a jump, but again, I'm just wondering, you talked about having an encounter a while ago, about having an encounter with a teacher, someone I guess that could be both positive or negative. You're talking right now about how they could be having a negative impact, but I'm assuming that what you're using TA to inform your work and do is helping educators have positive encounters with kids that maybe sit outside what I was talking about a while ago about teaching and learning, that the science doesn't become so important when actually the educator is taking on the role of helping these children. I don't want to go as far as using the word heal, because maybe that's too far, but see their potential or know their own power in being successful or whatever it might be. Is that kind of what your view is, Giles? So TA is, for me, it's not necessarily even ensuring that it's a positive encounter, but that encounter is possible.
Okay. And what do you mean by that?
I guess that might be the next question. I think that for educators, there is such an emphasis or pressure for them to make education full of certainty. So it has to be planned. We have to have lesson objectives. We have to have learner objectives. We have to have educational objectives, all of which are pointed towards particular outcomes. And those outcomes are concrete. And education now becomes a very strong concept, something that we can rely on to deliver. And I think that transactional analysis, with its emphasis on here and now, and the whole business of autonomy, that this really requires us to be willing to engage in an uncertainty. Being open to what might emerge. And that, I think, is quite countercultural for teachers. I did some work with a group And it really taught me the value of this. And I know that I taught this stuff really well.
Yeah.
And because I really enjoy teaching it. I've been teaching many times. And a couple of weeks later, when I met the group again, I asked them if they had any question about this particular bit of theory or what have you. And most of them couldn't remember it. And some of them couldn't. Not only they didn't believe I actually had taught it to them. And I did, joke with them about the fact that it had been a stunning bit of teaching, and but this was extremely. I was very crestfallen and bewildered. It reminded me that as a teacher, we can only have a teaching objective.
Right.
The idea of having a learner objective is ludicrous. The idea that I can command the learner, the meaning that the learner is going to make,
and what's going on inside them,
absolutely ridiculous.
Really interesting.
And it just reminded me that despite all efforts, what we can control as educators is probably very little. Really, but what we can do is marshal or be in touch with who it is that's showing up.
Yeah.
So the phrase I use is if teaching involves interrupting the lives of others, you better be damn sure about who it is that's showing up.
Right.
And I suppose that's what I'm, my response to John's piece about a positive encounter.
Yeah.
I'd say, I don't know that I can even control that it's going to be a positive encounter, but I do need to do my best. I need to have as much regard for how I'm showing up in it.
Yeah.
How do I hold myself in this in a way that, on the one hand, honours the other person to make their own meaning of this, but also bring the very best of oneself, really.
Yeah.
And that's where TA, I think, is very useful.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Great answer.
That broadens it out as well, doesn't it, then, to so much more than schooling, and maybe people having an educator identity when they don't necessarily realise they do, because that might not be their job title.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about parents, and I'm thinking about managers, and I'm thinking about anybody that has quite a large influence on people, that maybe we're learning all the time, and maybe we're also educating all the time.
Yes, John. I think one of for me, a key distinguishing feature between the work of educators in TA and perhaps those in clinical work, from those in clinical work, is that the educator's work is done in public. And I think some of those other folks that you mentioned there are in the public sphere. This work or practice that is observed, is witnessed, and there is something, I was going to say, common about it, in the literal sense, that there is a commonality or a common space in which this practice is developed. It's in community. Rather than, if you like, in private or in some kind of hidden place.
So it's almost like a role that maybe you're not even paid for, that it's not necessarily your job, but that we have a role in society.
Possibly, quite possibly, yeah. Certainly I can think of people that I've learned a great deal from who were not formerly teachers, but they knew how to hold themselves. Yeah.
And so, just broadening it out further, so we're talking about the role of transactional analysis. For our listeners, what do you think the common myths are around transactional analysis? So what would you be debunking in terms of ideas and myths around the subject?
Oh, gosh, that's a really interesting question. Let me pause for a moment and think on it.
Sure.
Yeah,
because I'm thinking that some people out there are going to probably have, may have heard of books like Games People Play.
Yeah.
What Do You Say After You Say Hello? These books were really popular.
I'm okay, you're
in the
okay.
60s. Yeah. And I know that some people definitely have this image of TA being pop psychology, or not very credible. Other people, on the other hand, then think it's extremely credible and has an awful lot to offer, both professionally and personally. What do you have to say about that?
This is the tension, because I was going to say it's not simple, and yet it's really accessible, which suggests simplicity.
Yeah.
It's like anyone can get their head around this, but that doesn't equate to it being superficial.
Yeah.
So there's I think there's a tension that's misunderstood, that's not recognised. So it's easily misunderstood.
Yeah, that's a great answer.
So So that's one of them. I think the closer you get to it, the other thing that I do feel quite strongly about is that it's not only a clinical model, and I think that's the biggest myth within the community.
And what do you mean by, for the listeners, what do you mean by clinical?
So I think there's a common understanding that transactional analysis is only really used by psychotherapists and counsellors.
Yeah, okay.
And only used in relation to people that have some kind of dysfunction, some problem that needs solving.
Yeah.
There's some health crisis, or some counselling issue.
Yeah.
And I find that the one that bugs me most.
Okay, great.
Yeah, because we've essentially just spent the majority of our time talking so far talking about education, so that suggests to me that it has quite a wealth to offer in areas outside of mental health or like clinical work, like you suggested. And in a way, maybe is that another problem sometimes with it not maybe being recognized or well known, is it unusual to have a modality to have so much to say about so many fields? Because I'm trying to think of something that might be similar to TA, and I'm not like, you think about cognitive behavioral therapy, it's very focused in on mental health and clinical work. It doesn't typically have an awful lot to say about education or organisation. So is TA unique in that sense, and does that cause its problems for it in its own right?
I think yes is a short answer, although I do know that the person's, there's a strong educational focus through the work of Carl Rogers and the person-centred movement. And certainly, there are some Jungians who talk about the educational relevance of his work. But I think TA might be unusual in being determined to qualify and accredit non-clinical application. Just as you were talking there, I was wondering what I have a little fancy, which is that most TA that people come across and most TA that's being shared is actually not through the clinical fields.
Right.
I think so many people come across the trauma triangle in some kind of training that they do
in the workplace, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I just wondered whether or not that might be the case. I don't know. I'm speculating there.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you. I've heard a lot of people, and even if it's not referenced to TA, they still have the words drama triangle,
Yeah.
And so why, like for you, why do you think, because you've touched on this, but why do you think TA isn't so well known amongst the general public, who this podcast is targeted towards?
Well, the fact it's called transactional analysis doesn't help.
Yeah.
I think that's a really unfortunate kind of early error, really.
Right.
Because, of course, it's a brilliant explanation for what it's about.
Yeah.
But you really need to be in on the inside before that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think that's...
Have you got any fantasies about what you would call it?
I've asked that before.
I thought about asking that question, but it's a nasty one, that.
It's a very... Yeah.
difficult one to answer.
Yeah, I was asked it for some time ago, and I still haven't come up with something.
Yeah.
Tough one.
I can't think of anything either. Yeah. Very good.
That's
So,
a bit of a blight, really.
yeah.
I also, I do think, though, that the psychodynamic orientation of TA also keeps it at the side, if you like.
You've talked across a breadth of stuff, Giles, and there's some really rich nuggets in there. I'm wondering, people who are listening to this and kind of going, oh, that's really interesting, I want to know more. Where would you signpost them to? What type of introductory books, particularly for educational TA, I suppose, because that's kind of what we focus on. So if somebody knew nothing about TA, where would you kind of suggest that they go? Is there websites, books, etc. that you would recommend?
Yeah, I'd say that if people have heard that discussion earlier about the cycle of development, and particularly parents or people interested in raising kids, then Growing Up Again by Jean Elsley Clark is the go-to.
Great.
It's such a rich resource, I think. I'd really recommend that. Yeah, it's such a clever book, and it talks as much to the parents' process as it does about the children's, and it's you get a lot of bang for your buck with that book.
Excellent.
There's a lot in it. Yeah, so I'd recommend.
That's one I've not read yet, so I'll be doing that myself. And whereabouts if they want to get in touch with you, Giles, if they want to find out more about you, where can they go?
Yeah. Probably best through my own website. Yeah. Which is gilesbarrow.com.
I'm probably going to push it here now, but I'm trying to think of the other people who are probably listening in, and I think Growing Up Again is a great suggestion for parents. Yeah. What about budding teachers out there, or teachers who are generally just really interested in this sort of stuff? Is there a more specific text that you'd advise them to go look at?
Yeah, so for those involved in adult education, for example, then Tactics by Rosemary Napper and Trudy Newton is a title that has just really done its time. Yeah, it's been not done its time. Sorry, it's been around a long time. It's really stood the test of time. That's the phrase.
Great.
And again, clever book, and it's more a how to. It's a really practical volume of translating TA concepts into working directly with groups around teaching and learning. And yeah, very, very practical. Loads of exercises, but also some really good material as well. So Tactics, and it's in its second print.
Brilliant. Great.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
And before we close, is there anything else that you'd like to share? Just anything else on your mind in regards to the subject of transactional analysis you want the listeners to know?
Yeah. I would say one of the blind spots in TA, which I'd like to think is at the beginning of changing, is that it's tended to see the relationship purely as a sociological one. In other words, TA helps us understand what goes on between people. But I think in this day and age, we've become increasingly aware that there's a third dynamic, if you like, which is me, you, and the environment. Yeah. And I think that's the new territory in TA. And I wonder whether or not, if we were as a professional community to get our act together on that, we might open up new avenues for a new generation of people to get involved.
Right.
If we started to speak to what I particularly hear that younger generation being concerned about.
Yeah.
And at the moment, there aren't many specific psychological movements that have fully understood and embraced it, because I think that clinical tradition sees it about sees the challenge about human pathology.
Yeah.
And B is a relatively private affair. Whereas I think the climate makes it an ecological dynamic, and it's everybody's affair. It's something that's more than public. It's kind of planetary, really.
Such an important note to finish on. So so relevant to what's going on at the moment.
Yeah, poignant. Yeah,
All I can imagine now, as you've said that, really is Greta, because I found myself lately saying, "What would Greta do?"
Really,
and I have a dilemma.
Yeah.
So it's like, what kind of TA does she need?
Yeah, exactly.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time and for all your wisdom and those nuggets of information. There's so much value in what we've just discussed. I think so much information is going to be incredibly helpful and useful. Really.
Thank you so much, Giles. It was great. Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I've very much enjoyed it. I'm more than happy to come back.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'm sure there'll be an invite in the future.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Okay.
Thanks,
cool.
Giles.
As always, if you found anything in today's episode interesting, please feel free to reach out. You can connect with us on all major platforms: Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can email us at 3peopleinyourhead@gmail.com using the number 3 rather than the word. If you aren't already, please follow us on iTunes and Spotify and leave a review. Thanks for listening.
Are you looking at my screen? Can you see my whole screen?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Better have nothing embarrassing on that screen.
Why don't you
record
each one of those?
Okay, I'm just thinking.
In your most,
do I kind of
charming, sing-songy?
Do I sound kind of froggy?
Cork accent? No, you sound alright. Well, we'll record it and then you can decide later.
I'm going to do one more.
Great. And this time you can go, "This is 3 in your head." We can vary it later. Sorry. You're going to say it with a smile on your face now. Change the sound.